"Are these my grandchildren?" the alien queen whispered. Her daughter stood beside a human with twins. The gate post at Velrath Prime had a logbook that recorded, on average, one unscheduled arrival every 14 days, and the guard currently on duty, a narrow-shouldered young man named Petrick who had been assigned to this particular post specifically, because his superiors believed nothing interesting ever happened here, had been counting on that average to hold for at least another week. It did not hold. At 11 minutes past the second daylight bell, the perimeter sensors chimed in a register Petrick had only ever heard during drills, and when he looked up from the logbook he had been half-heartedly updating, he saw 4 figures walking up the long, dust-pale access road as though they had every right in the world to be there, which, as far as his sensors could tell him, they did not. He did the thing every border guard on every world is trained to do in moments like this, which is to say he panicked in a controlled and procedural manner. He hit the comm panel, opened the channel to the central garrison, and discovered that his voice, which he had always considered reasonably steady, had developed a small but noticeable tremor. "Unscheduled arrivals at the South Road," he said. 4 individuals, repeat 4. The voice that answered him belonged to Sergeant Una, who had manned the garrison comm desk for 11 years, and had heard every possible variation of a nervous junior guard's voice cracking over an open channel. 4 individuals doing what, Petrick? "Walking," Petrick said, because it was the truest thing he could say, and then immediately regretted saying it, because Una's silence on the other end had the particular quality of someone deciding whether to be amused or concerned. "They're walking," she repeated. "Up the access road, toward the gate. I don't have clearance flags on any of them. The scan is reading 2 human pattern signatures, 1 Velratha pattern and 1 I don't actually recognize the pattern, Sergeant. It's reading mixed." "Mixed how?" Petrick looked at the readout again, hoping it would have changed into something that made more sense, the way a word sometimes resolves itself if you stare at it long enough. It had not changed. Mixed like 2 species worth of mixed. I think it might be reading 2 individuals as 1 signature because they're standing close together, but the pattern itself doesn't match anything in the database. It's both, Sergeant. It's reading as both at once. There was a pause on the line long enough that Petrick began composing, in his head, the apology he would give when Una eventually informed him that the equipment was malfunctioning, and he was an idiot for not checking it first. Instead, what she said was, "Describe them, visually, use your eyes, not the scanner." So Petrick did, squinting against the glare coming off the dust, and what he saw, working his way from the front of the small group backward, was this. A Velrathi woman in traveling clothes that were practical rather than ceremonial, her blue-toned skin catching the light in the way Velrathi skin always did, faintly luminous along the cheekbones, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this exact road before and felt no particular need to hurry along it now. Beside her, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed in the loose way of people who are comfortable being near each other, a human man, sandy-haired, dressed in clothes that were trying very hard to look like they belonged here and not quite succeeding, his expression caught somewhere between determination and the specific kind of nervousness Petrick himself currently felt, which made Petrick like him immediately and without reservation. And between the 2 adults, holding a hand each, 2 small children, perhaps 5 or 6 years old by human reckoning, walking with the particular seriousness small children adopt when they have been told an occasion is important without being told exactly why. "There are children," Petrick said, because this seemed like the detail Una most needed. "What kind of children?" "What kind, Petrick?" Una's voice had gone very flat, very careful, the voice of someone trying not to lead a witness toward an answer she suspected, but did not yet want confirmed. "What do the children look like?" He looked again. The smaller of the 2 had skin a shade that sat exactly between the woman's blue tint and the man's pale human tan, a soft gray lavender that Petrick had never seen on anyone, and ears that tapered upward into a point in the unmistakable Velrathi fashion, though smaller and somehow rounder at the tips than an adult Velrathi's, the way a kitten's ears are a smaller, softer rumor of a cat's. The other child had the same coloring, the same ears, but a face shaped more like the man's, the same set to the jaw, the same crease at the brow when concentrating, currently being employed in the serious business of not stepping on any of the larger stones in the road. They look like both of them, Petrick said slowly. At once. Like, I don't mean they're walking near both of them, Sergeant, I mean their faces are both of them. Can that? I didn't know that was something that could happen. It's not something that's supposed to be common knowledge that it can happen, Una said. And there was something underneath her voice now that Petrick couldn't immediately identify, and would later, looking back, recognize as the sound of a woman doing very fast arithmetic about exactly how much trouble was about to descend on the garrison, and by extension on her personally. Petrick, I need you to tell me if the Velrathi woman has a particular kind of bearing to her. Straight spine. Doesn't apologize when she bumps into things. Looks at the guard post like she's deciding whether it's been maintained to standard. Petrick watched the woman's approach for another few seconds. She had, in fact, just glanced at the gate's outer fence with an expression that did look faintly, professionally critical. The way a person looks at something they used to be responsible for and have opinions about regardless of whether anyone asked. Yes, he said, exactly that, Sergeant. Who is she? Don't say anything to them yet. Just hold position, look official, and for the love of every star in the chart do not, under any circumstances, ask her for travel documentation. Why would I not ask for? Because, Petrick, Una said. And now there was something that might almost have been a laugh trying to fight its way up through the procedural calm in her voice. You may be about to become extremely famous at this garrison for entirely the wrong reasons, and I am going to need several minutes to decide whether to call the palace directly or whether I want that particular honor for myself. She cut the channel before he could ask anything further, which left Petrick standing at his post with his hand still resting on the comm panel, and the four figures now close enough that he could hear, faintly, on the wind, the sound of the smaller child asking the man something in a tone of great seriousness, and the man's answering laugh, low and warm and entirely unbothered by the fact that he was walking, unannounced, toward the gates of a palace whose existence he had clearly known about for some time, and whose current ruler he had, as far as Petrick's scanner could tell him, never formally met. Petrick straightened his uniform jacket, which did nothing useful and which he did anyway, and watched the woman lift one hand in an easy, unhurried wave, the kind of wave a person gives when they are not at all worried about whether they will be let in. She did not, he would note later in the report he spent considerably longer composing than the situation strictly required, look even slightly nervous. He supposed that, when you were who he was increasingly certain she was, there wasn't much left in the world or off it that could make you nervous about coming home. Sergeant Una did not call the palace directly, in the end, because by the time she had finished weighing the relative merits of doing so against simply walking the message up the hill herself, the decision had already been taken out of her hands by a junior communications officer 2 desks over who had been monitoring the garrison's general traffic out of boredom and had, upon hearing Petrick's description relayed second-hand, made the call without asking anyone's permission at all. This was technically a violation of at least 4 separate protocols, a fact the officer in question would spend the better part of the following month hearing about from no fewer than 3 different supervisors, and which he would, every single time, defend with the same unrepentant shrug and the same 5 words. I wasn't going to wait. The message reached the palace switchboard, which routed it to the seneschal's office, which was where things were supposed to stop, procedurally speaking, until a proper assessment could be made and the appropriate ceremonial machinery could be set into motion. The seneschal, a meticulous man named Aldrich who had served 3 monarchs, and considered unscheduled anything to be a personal affront to the natural order, read the message twice, set it down on his desk with the particular care of a man placing an unstable object on a high shelf, and walked it directly to the Queen's private study, rather than trusting it to any of the usual channels. Because some instincts override decades of careful procedure, and Aldrich's instincts were telling him loudly that this was one of those occasions. Queen Elener was reviewing trade correspondence when he entered, the kind of correspondence that required her full attention, and that she had been visibly failing to give it for the better part of an hour, her stylus tapping an unproductive rhythm against the edge of her desk. She looked up at Aldrich's face before he had said a single word and set the stylus down entirely. "You have the expression," she said. "I'm not aware that I have an expression, Your Majesty." "You have the one you get when something has happened that you have not yet decided how to feel about. You got it when the southern reservoir flooded. You got it when your nephew enrolled at the conservatory instead of the academy. What is it this time?" Aldrich, who had in fact rehearsed several different ways of delivering this particular piece of information on the short walk from his office, discovered that none of them survived contact with the Queen's direct gaze, and so he simply read the garrison's message aloud, in full, including the part about the children's faces being, in the gate guard's own words, both of them at once. Elener did not move for several seconds after he finished. Then she stood slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone testing whether her legs were still going to cooperate with her, and said, in a voice that had lost most of its usual royal cadence, and gained something much smaller and much more uncertain in its place, "Say that again." "The last part. The children's faces, Your Majesty." The guard described them as bearing features of both the Velrathi woman and the human man. He was quite insistent on the phrasing. He repeated it to the sergeant twice before she believed him, and she repeated it to communications twice more for the same reason. "Cora," Elener said, not as a question exactly, more as a word she needed to test the weight of out loud. "It's Cora. You're telling me it's Cora at the gate with a human man and two children who look like both of them." "I am telling you what the garrison reported, Your Majesty. I have not independently verified." "Aldrich." Elener's hand had come up, not quite a command for silence, more a request, the gesture of someone who needed a moment of quiet in which to feel something enormous before being asked to also be reasonable about it. "How long has it been?" Aldrich did not need to consult any record to answer this, because he had, in fact, been keeping a private and entirely unofficial count of his own, the kind of count a man keeps when he has watched someone he respects carry a grief she refuses to discuss. 6 years, 8 months, Your Majesty, since the princess's last correspondence, and considerably longer since her last visit in person. 8 years, Elener said. Since she stood in this palace and told me that loving someone the council disapproved of wasn't a request she was making, it was a fact she was informing me of, and that she would prefer I treat it as one. She laughed, a short, unsteady sound with very little humor in it and a great deal of something else. I told her she was being reckless. I used the word reckless. I have had 8 years to regret the word reckless, Aldrich, and I have used every single one of those years extremely poorly. Your Majesty, if I may. You may not actually, because I am leaving. She was already moving toward the door, and Aldrich, who had anticipated several possible reactions to this news, but not specifically the one in which the Queen of Velrath Prime attempted to exit her own study at a near run, found himself jogging slightly to keep pace. Your Majesty, protocol dictates that an arrival of this significance be received formally, with the appropriate honor guard assembled at the main gate, the ceremonial herald announcing. Aldrich, there is a herald whose entire professional function is to announce my arrivals, and I am asking you, as someone who has served me faithfully for considerably longer than is reasonable for one man to put up with anybody, to imagine for one moment what it will mean to my grandchildren if the first thing they ever see of their grandmother is a woman walking very slowly down a very long flight of stairs, while a man in an enormous hat shouts her titles into a horn. The hat is ceremonially required, Your Majesty. I didn't design it. I am aware you didn't design the hat, Aldrich. I am simply telling you that the hat is staying here today, and you may inform the herald that his horn will not be required, and that if he is upset about this, he is welcome to lodge a complaint with the council, who I am also not waiting for. By this point they had reached the outer hall, where word of the Queen's sudden and unscheduled departure had begun to spread with the particular speed that only court gossip achieves, so that by the time Elener reached the grand stair, no fewer than 6 additional staff members had appeared from various side corridors, with the transparent intention of escorting her properly. Among them, a steward named Petros, who had clearly been pulling on a ceremonial sash while running, and had only gotten one shoulder of it correctly positioned by the time he caught up. Your Majesty, the formal procession requires a minimum of. Petros, I love you, and I am not doing the formal procession. There are 17 steps to the formal procession, Your Majesty. I have them memorized. I can walk you through them as we go if that would help maintain at least some of the. You may narrate the 17 steps to me as we walk if it brings you comfort, Petros, but I want it understood that I will not be performing a single one of them. Elener was already several steps down the grand stair, moving at a pace that had abandoned every pretense of measured royal dignity, her formal outer robe trailing behind her in a way that would have caused the wardrobe mistress considerable distress had she been present to witness it, which, mercifully for everyone's blood pressure, she was not. Petros, to his credit, did in fact begin narrating the 17 steps as he hurried along beside her, a recitation that grew progressively more desperate and more abbreviated as the distance to the gate shortened, and the Queen's pace showed no sign of slowing. Step 4 is the ceremonial pause at the threshold. Your Majesty, you've already skipped step 4. We're currently somewhere around step 11 without having performed steps 1 through 10. I want it on record that I tried. Noted and recorded, Petros. Step 14 specifically requires the monarch to be seated before any embrace takes place, for reasons of dignity preservation, and I can already tell from your current velocity that step 14 is not going to happen either. It is not, no. I'm simply going to stop narrating around step 12, Your Majesty. If that's acceptable, there's no version of this where we recover the sequence. Completely acceptable, Petros. You've done admirably. By the time the small, breathless, only partially assembled royal party reached the outer courtyard, with its view down the long dust-pale road toward the gate, Elener's formal robe had come loose at one shoulder. Her crown sat very slightly askew in a way no one present had the courage to point out, and Petros had given up on protocol entirely in favor of simply trying not to trip over his own half-fastened sash. None of it mattered to Elener in the slightest, because from where she stood she could see, small still with distance but growing closer with every passing second, 4 figures walking up the road, and among them, unmistakable even at this range, the particular blue-tinted glow of skin she had not seen with her own eyes in nearly 9 years, walking steadily toward home as though she had never once doubted she would be welcome there. The distance between the outer courtyard and the gate was, by any reasonable measurement, not very far at all. A few hundred strides along a road Elener had walked more times than she could count, and yet she would later swear to anyone who asked, and to several people who did not ask, that it was the longest walk she had ever taken in her life, longer than her coronation procession, longer than the 3 days she had once spent crossing the Vethari salt flats as a young woman determined to prove she didn't need an escort. Petros kept pace beside her, having fully abandoned the 17 steps somewhere around step 12 as promised, and had switched instead to a kind of running commentary on the practical logistics of the moment, which Elener found she did not mind nearly as much as she should have. There is, technically, still time to send someone ahead to at least announce your approach, he said, slightly out of breath. Not with the horn. I've taken the horn fully off the table, but perhaps a runner, just so it isn't entirely a surprise. Petros, I am visibly the Queen of Velrath Prime, wearing a crown, moving toward the gate at considerable speed with most of my outer robe trailing in the dirt. I think the element of surprise resolved itself the moment I started running. You're not running, Your Majesty. You're walking very, very quickly. Call it whatever makes you feel better. Ahead of them, the figures on the road had also slowed, and Elener could see Cora's hand tighten briefly around the smaller of the two children's fingers, a gesture that looked less like caution and more like someone steadying themselves through someone else's grip. The man beside her, who Elener now had enough distance closed to actually study properly, had the particular stiff-backed posture of a person who has rehearsed a greeting so many times in his head that his body had started performing it slightly ahead of schedule. His chin lifted, his shoulders set, an expression on his face that was trying very hard to look composed and was only partially succeeding. It was the children Elener's eyes kept returning to, helplessly, the way eyes are drawn to the one thing in a room that cannot be looked away from. Petrick's report had not exaggerated. Even from this distance the resemblance was unmistakable, written into them in a way that no single feature could fully capture, and that seemed instead to live in the whole of them at once. The soft gray lavender of skin that belonged to neither parent and both, the small upward taper of ears too round at the tip to be fully grown into yet, the particular way one of them tilted her head when studying something unfamiliar. A gesture Elener recognized with a jolt because she had seen Cora make the exact same one as a child, standing in this very courtyard, watching the palace gardeners work. She stopped several feet short of the group, not by decision, but because her legs had simply made the choice for her, and for a moment nobody on either side said anything at all. The wind moved through the dust between them. Somewhere behind Elener, Petros made a small, valiant attempt at a formal opening address, got as far as "Her Majesty extends," before his voice failed him entirely, and he simply closed his mouth and waited with everyone else. "Are these," Elener said, and her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, half-formed, the question arriving before she had fully decided to ask it. "Are these my grandchildren?" Cora's chin had been lifted in something that might have been defiance a moment before, a readiness for an argument she had clearly braced herself to have all the way here, and Elener watched it dissolve into something far less guarded the instant the question landed. She nodded once and then again, as though the first nod hadn't felt sufficiently certain. "Yes," she said, "Mother, yes they are." Whatever remained of Elener's composure went the way of her crown's careful positioning, which had given up entirely sometime during the run down the grand stair, and now sat at an angle that would have horrified the wardrobe mistress. She crossed the remaining distance at a pace that abandoned every formal expectation a queen's arrival had ever carried, and knelt in the dust of the access road without appearing to register that she had done it, her formal robe pooling around her in a way that represented, by Petros' later private estimation, at least 4 separate violations of court dress protocol, none of which anyone present had the slightest interest in mentioning. The two children regarded this development with the open, unblinking curiosity that children reserve for adults behaving in ways adults are not supposed to behave, and the smaller of the two, a girl with her father's particular crease at the brow when concentrating, studied Elener's face for a long moment before turning to Thomas and asking, in the carrying whisper that children believe to be far quieter than it actually is, "Is that the grandmother from the stories?" "That's her," Thomas said, his own voice thick in a way he was clearly trying to disguise as casual. "The one with the whole planet. The very same one." The girl considered this information with the gravity of a diplomat receiving a treaty for review, then reached into the small satchel she had been carrying, the kind of satchel small children fill with objects of enormous personal significance and no obvious value to anyone else, and produced a smooth gray stone, which she held out toward Elener with both hands and an expression of great ceremonial importance. "I found this on the ship," she informed the Queen. "It's a good one, you can have it." Elener, who had faced down hostile trade delegations, planetary council votes, and on one memorable occasion an attempted coup, found herself entirely undone by a rock. She accepted it with both hands, with precisely the gravity the gift required, and said, "Thank you. This is, without question, the finest stone I have ever been given," which made the girl beam with the particular pride of a child whose excellent taste has finally been recognized by someone qualified to recognize it. The boy, meanwhile, had been tugging at Thomas's sleeve with increasing urgency, and finally managed to get out. In the stage whisper register his sister had clearly inherited honestly. "Are we supposed to bow? You said there might be bowing." "I did say that," Thomas admitted. "You showed me the bow last night on the ship." "I did show you the bow. Do it now." Thomas looked for just a moment, like a man whose careful preparations had arrived precisely on schedule, and were about to be deployed in front of an audience considerably more important than the one he'd rehearsed for, which was, Elener reflected later, an entirely accurate description of the situation. He cleared his throat, set his feet, and performed a bow that combined approximately 3 different planetary traditions, none of them quite correctly, with a flourish of the wrist that belonged to none of them at all, and seemed to have been invented purely for the occasion. There was a silence of perhaps 2 full seconds, during which Elener, still kneeling in the dust with a rock held carefully in both hands, processed the bow in its entirety, and then she laughed, a real laugh, loud and unroyal and slightly cracked at the edges with everything underneath it that wasn't laughter at all, and said, "That was, without exaggeration, the worst bow I have witnessed in 40 years of public life. And I include in that count the bow performed by an extremely drunk trade ambassador from the outer colonies who fell over halfway through it." "I practiced," Thomas said, with the wounded dignity of a man who genuinely had. "I believe you. I believe you practiced extensively, and I am telling you that practice did not help. In my defense, Your Majesty, nobody actually told me what the correct bow was. I asked Cora and she said, and I quote, 'Just do something, she'll be too distracted to notice.' That is, unfortunately, completely accurate strategy," Elener said, looking past him to where Cora stood, and the two of them held each other's gaze for a moment in which a great deal that had gone unspoken for nearly 9 years passed between them without either of them managing to find words for any of it yet, which seemed, for the moment, entirely sufficient. Elener rose from the dust, stone still clutched in one hand, robe a catastrophe, crown hopeless, and reached the rest of the way across the gap with both arms, and Cora stepped into them without any further hesitation at all. And behind them Petros, watching the entire formal protocol he had spent years studying disintegrate completely in the dust of an unscheduled afternoon, allowed himself, finally, a small and entirely unprofessional smile. It was Petros, in the end, who broke the embrace, not out of any lack of feeling but because someone in the courtyard had to be practical, and he had apparently decided, somewhere in the last several minutes of watching centuries of protocol disintegrate in real time, that his new and self-appointed role was master of practicalities rather than master of ceremonies. He cleared his throat with the particular delicacy of a man interrupting something he has no wish to interrupt, and said, "Your Majesty, I don't wish to intrude on the moment, but I feel I should mention that the kitchens have, for reasons that predate any of this and are entirely coincidental, already prepared a frankly enormous quantity of cake for an unrelated council luncheon this afternoon. And it occurs to me that nobody present has eaten anything since breakfast, and small children in particular tend to handle overwhelming emotional events considerably better when cake has been introduced into the proceedings." Petros, Elener said, wiping at her eyes with the back of one hand in a gesture entirely unbefitting a monarch and not caring in the slightest. I am formally promoting you, effective immediately, from seneschal to whatever title best describes a man who knows exactly when to mention cake. I'll have the council draft something, Your Majesty. I believe Minister of Timing has a nice formal ring to it. Approved without debate. And so the procession back up toward the palace, which Petros had spent considerable energy earlier in the day trying to choreograph into something resembling dignity, instead became the loosest, least formal parade the grounds of Velrath Prime had likely ever witnessed. The girl, whose name Elener learned along the walk was Myra, had appropriated one of the honor guard's ceremonial spears, a long, slim thing topped with a stylized representation of the planet's twin moons that had clearly never been intended for use as a walking stick, and was employing it as exactly that, planting it firmly with each stride and announcing to anyone within earshot that she was testing the road for holes, a service nobody had requested but which the guard in question, a young man who had clearly decided the safest course of action, was simply to let the small girl keep his spear, bore with remarkable good humor. The boy, whose name was Eli, had elected instead to walk directly beside Elener, matching his stride to hers with great seriousness, occasionally glancing up at her crown, which had not improved its angle since the courtyard and showed no sign of doing so, until finally he asked, with the bluntness only small children can deploy without it sounding rude, "Is your hat broken?" "It's not a hat," Elener said. "It's a crown. And no, it's not broken, it's simply sitting at what I consider to be a very stylish angle." "It looks broken. It looks stylish." "My dad has a hat that looks like that when he's been asleep in the car." "Your father," Elener said, glancing back toward Thomas, who had gone slightly pink at having his sleeping habits relayed to a planetary monarch within the first 10 minutes of meeting her, "sounds like a man of excellent and discerning taste in headwear angles." Thomas, walking now beside Cora with the particular loose-shouldered relief of a man who has survived the part of the day he was most afraid of, caught Elener's eye and offered something between a grimace and a grin. "For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I want it on the record that I was considerably more nervous about today than the beau suggested." "The beau suggested you were extremely nervous, Thomas. I don't think you need to clarify." "Right, fair. I just wanted to say properly, since I didn't manage it back at the gate, thank you for not having the spear guard run me through on sight. Cora warned me you might." "Cora," Elener said, glancing sideways at her daughter, who had the decency to at least look mildly guilty, "has clearly been telling stories about me." "In my defense," Cora said, "you did once threaten to have an ambassador's shoes confiscated as a diplomatic measure." "That ambassador was being deliberately obtuse about a water rights treaty, and I stand by the shoe policy completely. My point is, I gave Thomas a reasonably accurate impression of what he was walking into." "And yet he came anyway," Elener said, looking at Thomas properly now, the nervousness in him, the obvious care in the way he kept one eye on his children even mid-conversation, the way his hand found Cora's without either of them seeming to think about it. "That counts for something, you know, coming anyway." "I wasn't going to let her face this alone," Thomas said simply. "Any of it, the leaving or the coming back." "No," Elener agreed, something in her chest settling at the words in a way she hadn't expected. 8 years of carefully maintained distance and carefully avoided correspondence finally finding somewhere to set itself down. "I don't suppose you were." They reached the palace's inner hall to find that word had, predictably, traveled well ahead of them, and a small crowd of staff had assembled along the corridor under the thin pretense of having business there, none of whom made even a token effort to disguise their interest as the small procession passed, several of them openly pointing out Myra's commandeered spear to one another in tones of great delight. The promised cake, when they reached the dining hall, turned out to be not merely sufficient, but genuinely, almost comically excessive. a four-tiered confection clearly designed for 40 council members rather than 4 travelers and a queen. And Eli's eyes upon seeing it went so wide that Myra, never one to be outdone by her brother's reactions, immediately declared that she intended to eat the entire top tier herself, a claim nobody present took seriously, and which she nonetheless pursued with admirable, if ultimately unsuccessful, dedication. It was over that cake, with frosting eventually finding its way onto at least one royal sleeve, in a manner Elener found she minded not at all, that the real conversation finally happened. Not the grand reconciliation speech either of them might once have imagined giving, but something smaller and more honest, traded quietly between bites, while the children argued at the other end of the table about whether Eli's piece was objectively larger than Myra's. Elener admitted, in words that cost her more than any council address ever had, that she had spent 8 years rehearsing an apology she had been too proud and too frightened to ever actually send, and Cora admitted, in turn, that she had spent those same 8 years half convinced the door home had quietly closed behind her the day she walked through it, and that some nights, holding 2 children who would never know either of these worlds the way she once had known only one of them, she had wondered if she'd made the wrong choice entirely. Neither admission undid 8 years in a single afternoon, and neither of them pretended it could, but something in the space between them had finally been named instead of carried silently. And that, Elener thought, watching her daughter laugh properly for the first time since the gate, was very possibly worth more than any apology she could have drafted. Later, with the cake reduced to wreckage and the children finally beginning to flag with the particular suddenness of small bodies that have been running on excitement and sugar, and are about to run out of both at once, Elener walked the family to the guest wing herself, declining every offer of an escort along the way. Myra's borrowed spear finally surrendered back to its rightful guard somewhere around the second corridor in exchange for a promise of breakfast involving, in her exact words, more cake, but the breakfast kind. At the door, Cora paused, and Elener paused with her, and for a moment neither of them reached for anything as large as a final word on everything that had happened that day, until Cora said simply, "We're not leaving again tomorrow. Or the day after. I wanted you to know that before you went to sleep wondering." "I wasn't going to ask," Elener said, "though I confess I was going to wonder." "I know, that's why I'm telling you." Elener nodded, and found she had nothing else she needed to say to that, no speech, no formal welcome, nothing but the quiet, settled certainty that the road outside her gates had, after 9 years of staying stubbornly empty, finally brought home exactly what it was supposed to, and that whatever came next, the council luncheons and the treaty disputes and the small daily business of being a queen, would simply have to make room from now on, for 2 children with gray lavender skin and pointed ears who had already, in the space of one afternoon, learned that their grandmother's crown sat best at an angle, and that she was, when it counted, a very easy woman to win over with the right kind of rock.